Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the first lecture of literary translation. And as we examined before, we are going to start from page 3 in the very beginning of the book, and we are going to examine specifically a question regarding the role of translation in getting cultures close together. دور الترجمة في نقل الحضارات والتقريب بين الثقافات. So let's read together from page 3 an essay by Kenneth Hines entitled Translation and British Literary Culture. In an essay of 1821, Thomas de Quincey insisted that English literature needed the stimulus of foreign literatures. So it's with this literature of whatsoever land, unless crossed by some other of different breed, they all tend to superannuation. He was pleading for the study of some exotic but congenial foreign literature, namely German, to protect English from the dotage nevertheless and imbecility that had befallen French because of its refusal to admit influences from without or to form alliances with the exotic literature. If we moved a little bit further to the line starting with the discovery. The discovery of German literature and philosophy took place not just in Britain and France, but throughout Europe and beyond. From St. Petersburg and Moscow to Concord and Cambridge and so on. In an essay, James Paul Frederick Pitcher, de Quincey took as his subject his favorite German writer, Jean Paul. His first translation from him followed immediately in the same issue of the London Magazine. Over the next 10 years, he published further translations from Jean Paul, as well as from Kant and other German writers. The following part will start with Jean Paul. Jean Paul himself had been influenced by Sterne, who was widely read in Germany. In fact, in the 18th century, the whole continent had discovered Britain, and the British works of literature, philosophy, and science were extensively reprinted and translated, resulting in one of the most momentous literary and cultural impacts in the history of Europe. Now let's move on to the part regarding American literature. American literature was discovered by Britain and the continent, and at the end of the century and into the 20th century, Russian literature became widely known. The following page Greek democracy was prominent throughout Europe at the end of the 18th century and in the beginning of the 19th century in Germany and Britain for the rest of the century. Greek assumed an importance it had never before possessed in Western Europe. Translation played a great part, a large part in these literary discoveries, and in many more besides. In the wake of the Peninsular War, popular translations by Feuillet and Lockhart introduced British readers to the chivalric Spain of ballad and epic, a shift away from a general indifference in which Spanish literature meant little more than Don Quixote. Among Italian writers, Dante was read widely for the first time, often in Carey's translation. Let's move on to the next part of the answer of the question, which is related to the role of translation in getting cultures close together. The discovery of the Middle Ages was yet another powerful literary refocusing in this period, influencing both Romantics and Victorians. For Isabella, Keats drew on a 17th century English translation, and Tennessee's also works were founded on a story from several other writers based on Charlotte Guest's translation. Now let's move to the following paragraph. New discoveries were not limited to the European literatures. From the last quarter of the 18th century, Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit were studied in England. This direct knowledge of the language is what distinguishes the Orientalism of the Romantic Age from its earlier manifestations. Towards the end of the 18th century, Sir William Jones inaugurated a new, more closely verbal attention to Eastern literatures, an attention which would be further sponsored by the East India Company. These bodies supported some of the large series of the translations that made many Eastern texts available in English, like the Oriental Translation Fund and Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East. This new informed interest eventually bore fruit within British literary culture more generally, as in Shelley's imitation of the ghazal from the Arabic, or Tennessee's Locksley Hall, influenced by one of the Al-Mu'allaqat in Jones' translation. Persian poetry yielded Edward Fitzgerald's best-selling Rubaiyat of Al-Khayyam, and in America, Emerson was translated via German a number of Persian poems, while Whitman espoused a sort of Sufism in a Persian lesson. Also, the literature of China and Japan began to be translated, and in the early 20th century, they were to be a major component of British and American modernism. But dozens of other Eastern literatures were not translated at all. The following paragraph, which start with such minor figures as these, laid necessary groundwork for the major appropriation of German poetry by several writers and poets. The literature of the world in translation. Carlyle thought he could discern in the new British openness to German literature an idea and a phrase he added to the English language in 1831, translating it from Goethe. The emphasis was on contemporary writers, and since Goethe developed the concept partly in letters to and reviews of Carlyle, the history of the phrase illustrates in miniature the process it was coined to describe. Let's move on to the paragraph that starts with by the middle of the century, world literature began to assume its modern meaning of the literary works written in the many different languages of the world. Now let's move on to the completion or the other part in answering the question regarding American writers or American literature. American writers came late to the practice of publishing major translations. In 18th century Britain, Dryden's and Pope's renditions of classical texts rivaled those of their Elizabethan predecessors and drew renowned attention to translation as a literary art. The reasons of this were both political and economic. In the first place, the practice corresponded with the ideology of democratically society that thrived on its citizens' universal and easy access to print. So, print made the art of translation easy. Also, copyright laws. Copyright laws in Britain gave individual people control over the writing. But Americans, by and large, didn't like the idea of private intellectual property. The free circulation of texts and ideas was a key democratic value in the early republic. When the first Copyright Act of the United States, was enacted in 1790, it initially protected only American authors. Publishers were not required to pay royalties to foreign authors, which made it advantageous for American publishers to republish British works or translations of other European works. Under these provisions arose a practice of reprinting, which also made the act of transferring translations more wide. The North American Review was founded in 1815 and set itself the task of creating a literary culture in America that would compete with Britain's accomplishments while remaining true to the former colony's new national values. Also, here he is talking about the role of magazines and essays in publishing translation. The fascination with translation extended beyond European contexts. Explorers such as Alexander von Humboldt and Heinrich Schliemann also generated and participated in the fascination for all things exotic and oriental. This interest was largely driven by two crucial discoveries. First, the Arabian Nights, which circulated widely in translation and created an Orientalist vogue in the late 18th and early 19th century. So, by this part, we end answering the question regarding translation, which was a central practice and preoccupation even in original American literature that is not explicitly a translation of another text. So basically the answer of this question is covered thoroughly from page 3 to page 10 as you see in the PDF reader. Okay, so the answer of the question that says, write thoroughly about the role of translation in getting cultures and inspirations close together. You are going to summarize the points that we discussed from page 3 to page 10, and you will find a full and complete answer to this question. And please don't forget to support your answer with the proper reference and proper example. Let's move on to page 11. There are elements of literariness in literary texts that can be identified. The recognition of these elements is not a straightforward process, but it's implicit in the stylistic patterning of language, the effects produced, and their interaction in texts. The language of literary texts is multi-layered, and thus the identification of literary properties should be sought for at its different levels. For literariness is not an intrinsic property of a lexical item, a stylistic device, a special linguistic feature, but the product of the overlap of the different levels of the language of texts and the effects of that overlap. Let's move on to the page which starts from translation and literary translation. Now, let's begin with the part that is related to defining translation. When we define translation, what should we cover? First, translation is the process of rendering language between two written languages, changing an original text or an original written text in the original verbal language, the SL or the source language, into a written text in a different verbal language. Page 14. Often, though not by any means always, translation is rendering the meaning of a text into another language in the way the author intended the text. So here starts another question. Let's call it question number 2. Illustrate the process of translation, shedding specific light on literary translation. So in this part, we should begin with the several definitions of translation, in general translation, and then we will move on to the several definitions of literary translation. Translation is the act or process of rendering what is expressed in one language or set of symbols by means of another language. Another definition: translation is the replacement of textual material in one language by equivalent textual material in another language. Or translation is the expression in another language of what has been expressed in another. Translation consists in reproducing in the receptor language the closest natural equivalent of the source language message. Or translation is the replacement of a representation of a text in one language by a representation of an equivalent text in a second language. So, a good translation is that in which the merit of the original work is so completely transfused into another language. Let's move on to page 15. Under the title, what is translated, or what is to be changed, or what is to be rendered in the process of translation from one language into another, which is also included in the answer to our second question. Okay, so when we translate, what we actually translate are several items or several components. First, regarding grammar, what we translate is sentence, clause, word order, tenses, modals, questions. Regarding vocabulary, what we translate: synonymy, polysemy, antonym, connotations, collocations, idioms, proverbs, and metaphors. Regarding style, what we translate shall cover and take care and pay attention to formality versus informality, fronting, parallelism, ambiguity, repetition, redundancy, short and long sense, irony. Regarding phonology, specifically in literary translation and specifically in translating poetry, what we translate shall also take care of rhyme, rhythm, alliteration, consonance, assonance, meter, foot, stress, tone, and so on. What about literary translation in particular? Literary translation is a term used loosely to refer to the translation of literature. Perhaps translating literature or the translation of literature is more accurate than literary translation, for the latter can be sometimes unliterary in the sense that the translation of an SL literary text may fail to be literary in the TL. The following paragraph Ainani defines literary translation crudely as the translation of the different genres of literature, including poetry, narrative, and drama. Like other types of non-literary translation, it involves translation or transforming a verbal code into a different code. But unlike them, it's concerned not only in the referential meaning of words, but also in their significance and effects. Page 19, if we start the book with page 3, I define literary translation as a special type of translation that is concerned solely with translating literary genres and subgenres into literary pieces of work in the TL, accounting for all features of literariness and creative style of the original. Literary texts are of different types. They are described as literary genres. The major literary genres are 3: poetry, prose, and drama. Each of these genres has subgenres distinguished within it as follows. For example, in poetry, we have lyric poetry, epic poetry, ode, ballad, sonnet, and children's rhyme. In prose, we have novel, short story, both of which are narrative fiction, popular fiction, and tale. In drama, we have tragedy, comedy, farce, dramatic monologue, and so on. So, literary translation covers translating all these genres and subgenres. The first two are attended to in this work, especially the short story, the novel, and poetry. But throughout the course, we are going to translate several literary texts as well. So, up till now, we have covered the answer for 2 questions. Number 1, the role of translation in getting cultures close together. Question number 2, illustrate the process of translation, paying specific attention to literary translation. Now, let's move on to the third question, which is regarding the literary translator. What are the features and qualifications of the literary translator? Like any professional, the literary translator has to command certain capabilities and qualifications. I must insist that inasmuch as we do not have an ideal or perfect translation, there is no an ideal or perfect translator, but the literary translator should have certain aspects or certain features. In page 20, he has to be or he has to fulfill the following features. Number 1, due respect for the profession with a view to faithfulness and moral commitment to translating text from one language into another. No deliberate additions, alteration, deletions, any religious consideration or cultures shall be permitted. Number 2, accuracy of rendering in the sense that everything in the text should be included or taken into account in translation. 3, mastery of the two languages concerned in the translation, the SL and the TL, regarding the basics of their grammars, vocabularies, sound features. Okay, so he has to pay attention and be master of vocabulary, grammar, vocabularies, and sound features. Number 4, competence in tone. Competence in tone. Landers defines tone as the overall feeling conveyed by an utterance. Number 5, good knowledge of the different types of style of both languages, grammatical, lexical, and phonological features of style, in addition to the stylistic scale of formality. Number 6, good command of the difference between the conventions of the two languages involved. Number 7, good knowledge of the SL culture, not necessarily to the same extent of the translator's knowledge. Number 8, good awareness of the world around us and the knowledge shared by all humans about the latest changes and developments with respect to science and technology, culture, social, political, religious matters, and attitudes. 9, due respect for the TL readerships, religious, moral, social, cultures, sensitivities, and values. Number 10, specialism in translation. 11, the translator's personal possession of the best and latest monolingual and bilingual dictionaries and reference. In addition to these capabilities, the literary translator had yet further faculties to be equipped with. He has to be creative and inventive. Number 2, he has to have a special liking of literature. Number 3, psychological aptitude to live the TL literary translation with respect not only to events, but also more importantly to every word. Number 4, command of conventions of reading, understanding, and interpreting literature. 5, good knowledge of literary genres and subgenres in both languages. Number 6, considerable competence in figures of rhetoric such as metaphors, allegory, similes, puns, metonyms, symbolism, irony, and special fixed phrases. Number 7, awareness of the basics of sounds and prosodic features in both languages, especially alliteration, rhyme, rhythm, meter, foot, beat, and also prosody. Number 8, flexibility and open-mindedness, and also background knowledge of some famous works of literature. Number 10, working with a back of the neck idea that literature is symbolic, so translation also should have some symbolic features and multi-layeredness included. Number 12, perhaps most importantly, vast knowledge of the crucial role of style in the understanding, interpretation, and hence translation of literature. So, in this video, we have covered 3 vital questions that are essential in preparing for our syllabus. Number 1, the role of translation in getting cultures close together. Number 2, illustrating the process of translation and more specifically literary translation. Number 3, the features and the qualifications of a good literary translator. See you next time, inshallah.